So I'm sitting here in front of my Seder table and got all my accoutrement to have a Passover Seder. Karen covered a lot of the story of the Passover in the Story for All Ages, which is great because then when I talk about it, you'll be a little familiar with it. So I wanted to say good morning and thanking you for asking us to talk about Passover on Easter Sunday. The Last Supper of Easter was a Passover Seder. And I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the CBU Youth Board for having the synagogue have their second night Passover Seder in the fellowship hall, which was a great success. And I've heard they really had a good time and appreciated everything that was available there. My visual aids to my presentation include photographs that we took of items that we used for our Seder and several drawings from Naomi McCormick's 2019 Passover coloring book, which she gave me permission to use. This year, Passover began on Wednesday evening, April 5th, and will end at sundown on Friday, April 13th. During that week, we observe the Passover dietary restrictions where we can't, eat anything with leavening in it. So Mike has got the slide of the Israelites working hard in Egypt as slaves, and Passover commemorates the foundational event in Jewish history, which is the story of Exodus, which led to the birth of Jewish nation, Israel. In addition, the most basic and fundamental principles found in Judaism, faith, prayer, deliverance, freedom, service to humanity, are woven into this timeless story. Over the last 3,000 years, which is a long time, the celebration has changed from a more primitive celebratory dinner to a more elaborate and formalized service. It has endured as one of the most celebrated and widely observed Jewish holidays. And as I said, it occurs over 7 days. And Seder is the Hebrew word meaning order, and it delineates and then we have a book called a Haggadah, which we use to take us through the service. So the commandment to commemorate Passover, Mike is showing a slide of a Haggadah that we have at home, which was made by some friends of ours. And this is a traditional Haggadah with illustrations and illumination, and quite beautiful. The commandment to commemorate Passover is found in the book of Exodus and mentioned in Numbers and Deuteronomy. Historical evidence has verified the Passover celebration over these 3 millennia. Some examples include celebration by a slave who was taken prisoner in Babylonia in 586 BCE, by the teachers who compiled the Talmud about 500 CE, by a Jewish courtier in Arab Spain in the 7th century, by Moses Maimonides in Egypt in 1200, and by Hasidic Jews in Poland in 1776. And most importantly, in our time, on April 19th, 1943, the eve of the first night of Passover, was the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto was begun. And that was important to them, that was the night that they began their rebellion. So all of these people through the ages have celebrated the holiday of Pesach. The rituals of Passover are many. The languages used have been diverse. The circumstances have been as surprising as history. But one idea in the festival has remained unchanging, that it is a celebration of freedom. It is known universally as the season of liberation, liberation from winter, from bondage, from oppression. And the mandate to keep alive the spirit of freedom, generation after generation, has followed the commandment to tell thy children on that day about the struggles and significance of the deliverance from bondage, which led to the establishment of Mosaic law. And through the ages, Passover has become to symbolize much more. According to tradition, the Seder cannot begin before sundown. The Seder has two parts. And while the main meal is served at the end of part one, we do get to sample the symbolic foods of the Seder story along the way. The first part includes 10 of the 15 segments of the Seder. And that traditional meal, when we get to it, will include foods such as matzo ball soup, gefilte fish, roasted meat and vegetable, and it ends with dry fruit and a few macaroons. And then after dessert, we go back to part two where we have games and songs and prayers and psalms. So Mike is showing you pictures of my Seder plate. The first picture was empty, and it shows you where you put each of the elements of the Seder story. And so we've got a lamb shank, which is one of the primitive elements relating to how the Jews, or Israelites rather, were able to identify themselves during the plague, so that by putting blood of an animal on the door. And so that, and then we've got a hard-boiled egg and lettuce, which is our spring things because it's a spring festival. And we've got parsley, which is we dip in salt water, which is part of the Passover story, and horseradish, which is a bitter herb that reminds us that things were not so great during those times. And we have charosis, which is a mixture of, which is to the right of the lettuce on your screen, which is a mixture of dried fruit and a little wine and chopped nuts that represents the mortar used to build those pyramids and other Egyptian buildings. So how to prepare for Passover. The week before the beginning of Passover, you must cleanse and rid your kitchen of all food items which are forbidden, which are called chametz. These include any foodstuffs that will ferment and swell, such as wheat, spelt, rye, oats, or barley, distilled vinegar. And of course, there is a specific religious ritual to accomplish the gathering of the chametz and getting rid of it. What you'll need for a Seder is Orthodox Jews have a separate set of Passover dishes that they don't use any time else during the year, so they haven't been contaminated by non-Passover foods. And you'll need a pair of candles, which I have on my table. Mike, you can just go back to me on the screen. And I'll show some of the things on my table. See, I got these candles here, and you'll start the Seder by saying a prayer over the candles. And then you've got the Haggadah. And here again, I have an assortment of Haggadahs. You saw two of them. Another one we have is a Haggadah that's illustrated with drawings and paintings by Marc Chagall, who was a wonderful Jewish artist. And so you can get as fancy or as simple as you like. And so each person that's sitting at the Seder table will have a Haggadah so that they can follow the service. And Karen talked about the Seder plate and the significance of each of those items. And at the beginning of the fifth section of the Passover Seder, we get to tell the story of the Exodus. And so we have matzah, which is the unleavened bread. There's 3 of them. We get to break the middle one in half and hide part of it for a game in the second part where kids get to go looking for it and they get a prize when they, to whoever finds it. And then the other half we break into pieces and we get to everybody at the Seder. And each person has a little plate that they'll put all those symbolic foods on so that they can eat them at the time that they're told to in the story. And they each come with a separate blessing. So since other elements that we need kosher sweet wine, and we need 2 goblets. One is going to be for Elijah, who, if he arrives, will signify the coming of the Messiah. And in recent times, we have a glass or cup for water for Miriam, who was Moses' sister, who had a well that provided water during that sojourn for 40 years between the time they received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Moses came down, they had a pagan ritual going on, so then they get punished for 40 years in the desert, or they get to the promised land. So then they had to live on matzah and water, and think about what they did. And the number 40 features largely in Jewish texts. The flood, 40 days and 40 nights, 40 years in the desert. Moses was originally exiled for 40 years in the desert before the burning bush appeared to him and told him to go back to Egypt and help the Israelites leave. So there's just all these different practices that have evolved over all these centuries. And that's what makes it complicated. I just got my notebook. Okay, so when we start the Seder service, we begin with 4 questions, and the involvement of children in the Seder service is very important because they structure how we answer the questions of why is this night different from other nights? Why are there these certain foods? Why do we sit a certain way? All of these things. And so the actual getting to have dinner occurs at phase 10. So that can take a while to get to. So depending on how your family likes to celebrate the Seder, it can take a very long time since you can't start until after sundown. During the Seder, we will drink a cup of wine with a special blessing that mark different parts of the event. And at the conclusion of the Seder, we will say a prayer that asks for acceptance of our celebration and that what it means to us. And for my family, because we use this sort of homemade Haggadah, there's a pledge that we make where we say, we whose ancestors endured the bitterness of slavery and oppression at the hands of more than one tyrant, pledge tonight to keep the banners of freedom unfurled in our ceaseless struggle for peace and freedom within ourselves and throughout the world. And next year, may we all celebrate together again. So we talk about during the meal different kinds of bondage that enslave people, whether they're physical or political or emotional, and how we can help each other through those trials. I don't know if we have time for any questions. I'm not a scholar as far as that's concerned, but I did do a little bit of research and I can answer any questions if people have them.
Yeah, if there are questions, you can either raise your hand on Zoom or come to the front in the sanctuary. Are there questions? I just wanted to make a comment if I could, and that's that a lot of people I know really see celebrating Passover and having Seder as more of a cultural thing than a religious one. I know I have a fair number of Jewish friends who would tell you that they're atheists, but they have a Seder. Do you find that that's true? I think in a similar way, a lot of people who were brought up in Christian tradition might be atheists, but still celebrate Christmas or still celebrate Easter.
Yeah, well, and I think that is true. I think it is a time to sort of touch base with those religious and cultural roots. We have, started out as a people in what is called in the Middle Eastern part of the world, Asia Minor. But due to circumstances of choice and necessity, have managed to move to all different parts of the world. And so customs may be different, but the essentials of the celebration of Passover is dictated by the Haggadah. So if you're going to have a Seder, you're going to go through this whole service, but you can sort of decide which parts you want to go to. You can make the first part last 2 hours before you have the meal, and other people do it in 45 minutes. So that's personalize it.